Hello, Internet. This is Daniel with Driving and Dragons. Back today with some more Wizards of the Coast related, ruining the tabletop game space stupidity. To be perfectly honest, though, Wizards of the Coast, they're more of a symptom than the disease. The disease is the influx of players that they brought in that they have then in turn capitulated to. All these professionally offended folks, and they're just responding to that pressure because those are the loudest, squeakiest wheels, and the loudest, squeakiest wheels are the ones that get the grease. They also tend to make up a large section of the modern player base. The older player base doesn't have that much weight with them. Why? Because the older player base, we just don't buy their shit anymore. And since we don't buy any of their material anymore, we're not customers and we don't have weight to throw around. Our boycott doesn't matter because we weren't buying it to begin with because we didn't like the changes in the game and the way that it's kind of drifted towards a video game mindset. So this came to my attention from the OGGM. It was an article published here recently by Alphastream talking about some changes that Wizards of the Coast has made without errata into some of the books that have already been released, predominantly the core rule books, where they've started to do some DEI changes in language, diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a general rule, most of this stuff is bad on its front for the game itself. Take the politics out of it. You don't want modern politics, or even really modern language, used in your core books unless you're making a modern game. Because everybody agrees that a big part of the game is immersion, is getting into the feeling of the setting, the feeling of the world within the game. And using a bunch of extremely, especially a lot of postmodernist nonsense, postmodernist language, postmodernist ideals, postmodernist philosophy, and nomenclature in your core rulebooks doesn't do anything except continually pull your player or your reader back out of the setting. This is something that is very commonly talked about, especially in fantasy genre writing circles, is if you're doing fantasy genre writing, you don't want to use a bunch of modern language in your writing. You want to, especially when it comes to the dialogue of the characters, but you want to use more period correct dialogue in the way things were referred to in the period you're going for. Even if you're doing, say, a fantasy world that it's not Earth, it's some great fantastical world, like say you're in Forgotten Realms or something. Forgotten Realms is still analogous to like a late medieval period, early Renaissance period of the planet Earth, of our world. We disassociate from that vibe and that setting and that world, that feel, when you start using these modern words and modern language and modern reference. Like, nobody, period, end of story, in the 1400s was referring to anybody as indigenous peoples. So you don't put indigenous peoples in there. If you really want to play the placation game with the postmodernist permanently offended class, you can have a disclaimer. You can put a sidebar in there that says, hey, here is a discussion of language. I'll use an example that I'm somewhat familiar with. Colonies and Conquerors is a pretty solid game, a privately published game by Spirit Bear Studios. I did a review on it. While the core books are rough around the edges and could use some editing and could use some trimming and some polish, one thing that I point out is they basically have a section at the end completely separate from the rest of the rule book that talks about different modern concepts and how they reflect with this colonial era world. That's fine. It's not smattered all throughout the books, constantly in your face, snatching you out. It's a section at the end of the primary rule book where you can go in and say, hey, if I have some sensitivities here, here's why we use this word instead of this word. here's this concept instead of this concept. Here's how people react to these different things, like these mental disabilities or these mental illnesses or these personality traits or these sexual orientations, and here's how they were viewed by different cultures in that era and the way they reflect in the game. But of course, that's not enough for your crazy pronoun crowd, the leeches that are trying to bully game designers into giving them sensitivity reader credits and stuff like that, like the not so Asian D&D podcast people and those folks, which are just grifters. At the end of the day, that professionally offended class of folks, they're going to be offended no matter what, and all you're going to do is hurt the game for everybody else through these language inclusions. Moving forward, we're talking about what we can learn from Wizards of the Coast's core book sensitivity and inclusion changes. And I'm just going to kind of run down, and I guess I'm going to give them a rating of good, neutral, or evil to stay within the theme here on some of these things in terms of some of these changes. And some of these, as the article states, have been in place for months. This is not some kind of Wizards of the Coast formal announcement of how we're changing things. They've just done this kind of quietly in the background. I'm going to point out the ones that are stupid and the ones that really don't matter and the ones that, are probably not bad. So going down the list in this article, you can start off with some changes in the DMG. They talk about how the word savage, where they confront savage giants, ferocious hydras, were changed to things like brutal, or monstrous predators and savage raiders were changed to predators and merciless raiders. And then except to fight savage orcs was changed to fight ruthless bandits. Now, I'm going to go out and say that as a general rule of thumb, this is one of those neutral changes. First, it's really stupid that anybody has any sensitivity towards savage. Savage is a very good word in the English language to describe all of these things. It describes a pattern of behavior or a pattern of personality. So when you say savage orcs, it doesn't say all orcs are savage. It says these are savage orcs. They happen to have this personality. You talk about savage raiders and savage giants. Yeah, you're invoking something that's scary, and it's more period correct than like brutal, merciless, or ruthless, but those really don't hurt. They change the meaning a little bit, but not enough to matter in those cases. Then they come down and they say that, a wheel above a barbarian horde or a wheel above an invading horde. This, I'm going to go ahead and put in bad. And I'm going to put it in bad because of the way it's changed. Barbarian is a period correct term. Barbarian is a term that was used there to mean a specific thing. Now, you got these modernists who want to talk about, you say barbarian, you're degrading their culture. Yeah, we are degrading their culture because they are the enemy culture coming in. That is normal behavior and was a common term. I believe the very first usage of barbarian actually came in the Roman Empire because they essentially said that the people, their language that they didn't understand sounded like bar, 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 bar. So they were the barbarians. They were these foreigners. While that particular example, barbarian horde versus invading horde, all it does is make it more vague. Oh, it's an invading horde. Horde of what? Horde of kittens? Horde of mongrel dogs? Horde of people? What kind of invading horde is it? Barbarian horde. Okay, it's a horde of aggressive foreigners. But it doesn't really, it's not the kind of thing that really harms anything. So giving it that, we'll just slide it into that neutral category. And he goes into some stuff in the monster manual, some changes in the monster manual. Predominantly removing the use of civilized and savage to discuss different things. So other civilized folk might be friends versus other folk who might be friends or rivals. Almost as numerous, but far more savage and brutal, and almost uniformly evil are the races of goblinoids. Changed to are the races of just removed entirely. Almost as numerous are the races of goblinoids. Their raids against civilized lands was changed to, which is just removed, their raids. And let's see, when they established lairs and settled near the rural edges of civilized lands, was changed to settled lands. This is one of those things where it becomes a problem. It is civilized lands. Civilized means it has a meaning, especially within the context of that time period. We're the civilized people. I know the postmodernists love to get their panties in a twist because, they had their own culture and their own culture was no less civilized than ours. That's modern usage and has no place here. We know what it means. We know that it's not meant to say that it doesn't target anybody, but that is a good word for it. Civilized lands, they're just as wrong to call it settled lands. It's settled by the orcs and the raiders. It just doesn't have settlements. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, it does. They have orc camps, which are basically just mobile towns. They have nomadic tribes. It's definitely settled. It just doesn't have permanent settlements or towns or whatever the case may be, or it's not part of whatever nation state or political organization happens to be in that region. So changing it from civilized to settled actually this is a bad change. This will fall under evil. Because this is an attempt to placate postmodernist ideals by changing language in a way that is actually less accurate and it doesn't even convey the proper information. If you look in context, civilized versus not civilized in a fantasy context or in this kind of context would mean civilized reflects the predominant civilization of the area and the region. You can use that to explore all kinds of stuff about seeing these cultures as lesser and how it's wrong and how it's bad, if that's what you want to do. But you can't do that if you take that language out, because you need to have that perception there. And that is going to be how people in that era would have referred to these other nations. Moving on, they'll say adventurers, no longer do adventurers head back to civilization to rest. They head back to their home base. Or a fierce warrior of a primitive background is now just a fierce warrior. These would also fall under evil. These are bad changes. Why? Because a primitive background. Yes, especially if they are primitive compared to the speaker. Okay? The Middle Ages are primitive compared to modern society. This is the definition of the word. That's what primitive means. It means that it's older or antiquated or technologically inferior, less developed. And yes, those primitive raiders are primitive compared to people who live in walled cities with plate armor. They're wearing hide, we're wearing modern plate armor and ring mail and that sort of thing. That is an appropriate use of the word, and it is not insulting. Same thing, civilization to home base. Home base is not a period correct term. Home base is where Navy SEALs go back to their forward operating base, not adventurers. We may use the term home base as a shorthand as players, but it has no place in the actual nomenclature of the game. And really, to be honest, this is kind of stupid that this is included in the players' handbooks and DMGs anyway. It just shows how the game has progressed back to a video game-esque mentality as opposed to a role-playing or even storytelling mentality. We didn't have home base. We have the castles. It may be your home base, but that's not the proper nomenclature for the time. You can even say going back to the fort or the castle would be better than going back to their home base. It's just modern language that takes you out. You've got talking about how barbarians have changed. This is the one that really stuck out to me. Take pride in how their civilized ways set them apart from animals, as if denying one's own nature was a mark of superiority. To the barbarian, they changed that to take pride in their settled ways, as if denying one's connection to nature were a mark of superiority. To a barbarian, though, a settled life is no virtue. This is another bad change, mainly because this is more postmodernist crap. You could say that in a way it's a little bit more accurate, but it's really not. You're talking about a more loose, less developed society versus a more structured and advanced society. More civilized is perfectly acceptable here, especially because it reflects the language that would have been used in a similar time period. Whereas this whole less settled ways, there are plenty of barbarians who are settled. For instance, let's use real life as an example here. Most of your Vandals and Gauls and your Nordic peoples, Julius Caesar invading Gaul and fighting those barbarians that were in those lands, which are essentially France and Spain and Germany, these Germanic tribes and whatnot, they lived in villages. They weren't nomadic. They had fortresses and encampments and permanent settlements. They were plenty settled. And they still would have been referred to as less civilized because they were more primitive. These are the correct words. So now you're talking in a way, it's ironic because by changing it from less civilized to less settled ways or their settled ways, you have now pigeonholed your barbarian into a nomadic tribe. They can no longer be just a tribe that lives in less advanced villages or something of that nature, or has forts, or like it's like the British tribes like ancient Wales, or like when you start talking about like Gwynedd or Powys or something like that. You can't say that anymore for your barbarian. Why? Because now it's the less settled people, and those people are very settled. So congratulations, wizards. You made a change that's not only less accurate, but also pigeonholes your barbarians. Same thing. Change to civilized lands, change to another land, fight against civilization's foes in a fight against monstrous foes, beyond the walls of civilizations or in the unsettled lands. And then between civilization and the terrors of the wilderness, change to between the people you protect and the terrors. Some of those are not as bad as others. Because you can say between the people you protect as opposed to between you and civilization. It's wordier, which is a problem. It makes it a harder read. It doesn't flow as well. But it doesn't really hurt. Fighting against civilization's foes instead of fighting against monstrous foes. Not really a problem there, though. Once again, are all your foes monstrous? Those look like humans over there. That's a tribe of other humans that are attacking you. Are we not going to defend against them because they're not monstrous? Or are we going to say that these humans are monstrous and we're not supposed to have a problem with that language? This is where you start getting into this problem of trying to placate people. They move in from things of hordes of orcs and humanoid hordes, from rampaging ogres and hordes of orcs, change to from rampaging ogres to towering giants. Like they basically just cut and hordes of orcs out. Then ravages of monsters and humanoid hordes change to ravages of monsters that press in from. They're literally just cutting things out. Cutting out more descriptive text that helps paint a picture in your head. For whatever reason, to avoid the word hordes? Like, why are we taking hordes out? Who is mad about hordes? Why are we saying orcs are burly raiders instead of savage raiders? Why are we taking the words pillagers out? Why are we taking away stooped postures, low fours, and piggish faces with piggish faces? Why is this language being moved out when that's literally how you physically describe them? Why are we taking out crossbreeds? Orcish goddess of fertility and wife of Grumsh demands that orcs procreate often and indiscriminately so that orc hordes swell in generation after generation, and they reject notions of racial purity. Why is this stuff being removed to add words like the offspring and progeny, and they proudly welcome others? Why is this being changed? This is totally changing the demeanor of that society. And once again, we have an irony that comes into this where Wizards is literally taking something and they are pigeonholing and reducing something that's unique about those orcs by shaming they're literally shaming something by trying to take away shaming, quote, shaming language. Congratulations, you took out the quote, shaming language and replaced it with an actual shaming description. Or they should, maybe they shouldn't be proud of their description. That is just stupidity. Then they moved in, they talked about how they changed different things about madness, insanity, and crazy. No longer have mad necromancers, just necromancers. There's no longer a plane of madness, just a plane of overwhelming chaos. Many of them have been driven mad by the incessant winds or force. Change to, The incessant winds have driven many to delirium and forced others. Things like an insane wizard have been changed to a villainous wizard. I want you to think about that for a second, how stupid that change is. First off, who is triggered or hurt by the word insane? That in itself is insane. Insane describes somebody whose brain does not work in a normal fashion, who has an altered perception of reality due to chemical imbalance, trauma, whatever the case may be, that has driven them to be no longer sane and outside of the norm. Villainous implies intent. So once again, we have that irony where wizards actually is more damning towards what they're supposedly trying to soften their language toward. They're no longer calling the wizard insane because no, everybody's thoughts and everybody's reality. We're all entitled to our own reality, so we can't say that he's outside of reality. But we are now going to say that he's villainous, which implies intent and implies malice, whereas insane does not imply malice. So congratulations, you've just irrevocably made him evil, irrevocably made him bad in an effort to not use a hurtful word that's not really hurtful to anybody. Elves useful and crazy enough, as opposed to useful and foolhardy enough. That one's not so bad. Foolhardy is probably the better word for that case. And foolhardy actually fits with the time, so we get our first little pip where we can throw it in the good. Changing crazy to foolhardy when you're talking about somebody who's taking rash action or disregarding their safety, not a bad one there. Is probably the better word, to be honest. But when they say demons go insane with fear as opposed to demons are overcome by fear, that's not the same thing. And it's not an accurate description. It literally takes away. And it lessens that fear by trying to protect who? Going insane, being overcome by fear means that I just run away because I have to get away from it. Going insane with fear means the fear has broken my mind and I can no longer accept reality. I can't see things normally anymore. This is a major change. There's other examples in here. It says, examples of below. First of the Dungeon Master's Guide and these various capable, maybe helpful references for creators. This sentence is a herald, town crier, mad person, or other individual makes an announcement. Change to a herald, town crier, a prophet, or another individual makes an announcement. Why? A prophet? I mean, sure, you could be a prophet, but not every mad person is a prophet. Not every prophet is a mad person. These are not the same thing. Changing a mad woman standing on the street corner spouting fragments of an ancient prophecy versus a soothsayer standing on the corner. Mad woman is a completely different thing than a soothsayer. They draw up a totally different image. You have now altered a character because you don't like the word mad woman. Now we don't even know what their gender is. They're a soothsayer. That can be male or female. A soothsayer is not somebody who just spouts prophecy. A typical campaign, characters aren't driven mad by the horrors they face and the carnage they inflict. Change to, in many campaigns, little focus is placed on the mental and emotional impact of the dangers characters face. This is not good change. While it kind of conveys the same thing, it doesn't conjure any emotion. It's dead. This is dead language with no emotional content that hurts the overall flow of the game. It hurts the narrative. It takes you out of that exciting world and puts you into this pedantic, sterilized academic view of things. The constant risk of insanity replaced by cosmic horror. Because cosmic horror is the only way to go insane? Do they even know what cosmic horror is? Insane circumstances from the aliens of madness versus bizarre? Once again, we're using words that don't mean the same thing, are far less accurate, and don't conjure the same image. The writings of raving lunatics versus incomprehensible scrawlings of witnesses. Now they're just witnesses, and their incomprehensible scrawlings. That you've now taken everything away from the person. Knowing what the source is important in the context of that particular sentence. And in an attempt to try and make tormented captain, like here in the Monster Manual where they changed raving lunatics to tormented captives. Those are not the same. You can be a tormented captive and be completely sane. Okay? And not raving at all. I mean, maybe I'm traumatized from being tortured and tormented, and I'm comatose, basically. I sit in the corner with my eyes just staring out dead, not saying anything. I'm certainly not raving. By trying to change the language, you're literally changing the meaning of everything. And since this is getting a little bit longer, I'm going to flip through a few more of these going down here. When they talk about bioessentialism, where they're changing, the drow have taken an interest in breeding Quargoths as opposed to recruiting and training, because those are the same thing. Why are we worried about breeding? They're animals. We breed animals all the time. And yes, you breed slaves, and breeding slaves dehumanizes them. You want that. You want your players to feel that these people, or that these victims are being dehumanized by the evil race or the evil characters. They are evil because they dehumanize people that shouldn't be there. You should use terms like racial purity, because that's how they view. You shouldn't change dim-witted to incurious. They're not the same thing. Incurious implies that they just don't care. Dim-witted implies that they're not capable of processing the information. And then you get into some of the worst stuff where they start talking about being blinded to something, being changed to just unaware. I guess you could call that neutral, because being blinded to something and being unaware of something, they're not the same. Being unaware simply means you don't know. Being blinded means there's literally something preventing you from recognizing it. And I don't know of any blind people who are offended by saying that I was blinded to something or I was blind to something. It's good use of descriptive language, and they're just being stupid about it. But I guess that kind of falls into neutral, because it's rarely going to be that big of an issue. We know what you mean. But when you say you can play male or female without gaining any special benefits or hindrances versus choose your character's sex, gender, and sexual orientation, think about how your character interacts with the broader culture's expectations about these characteristics as to does or does not conform. These are stupid changes when you're talking about, oh my God, you said there's male or female. Well, yeah, because I'm going to tell you a secret here. These ancient civilizations that we had, Middle Ages and whatnot, they really didn't have a concept for something that wasn't male or female other than like a hermaphrodite that was considered a complete abomination and anomaly. All right? And before anybody wants to jump in and start talking about, well, what about the two-spirited folk? What about two-spirited folk and the Native Americans? I hate to tell this to you, but the two spirits or the twin spirit people, that came about from Canadians in the 1990s. That was not a concept in ancient or even in colonial era Native American culture. That is something that was come up with by modern liberals and just shoehorned in. You want to talk about the same kind of like just stupid like cultural appropriation and whatnot. Let's sit down and say, what would the Native Americans come up with to describe somebody who is a man who thinks they're a woman while we smoke them peace pipe and say how and put on our big feathered headdress? I mean, you want to talk about just totally tone deaf and oblivious to their own hypocrisy. And you got this same kind of nonsense that you've got through here. A male drow cleric defies the traditional gender divisions of society. And going back to, Corellin sees them as embodying their deity's transcendence of sex and gender and some elves' connection. These are not concepts that are a big thing in that kind of period. This is more, let's pull more modernism in here and take ourselves completely out our period and our scenery and our... the word escapes me now, but just the overall feel of the world. You got the stuff where they want to change the word honor to other warriors who adhere to formal codes, and taking out the word phylactery to change it to like a soul jar or some other nonsense in some of these books, because that might trigger traditional Judaism to be mad. Changing slaves to servants. Slave pens to quarters for enslaved creatures. Why don't we make the evil bad guys seem less evil and less bad by just really muting what they are? They didn't take any slaves. They took servants. Wow, they took servants. They didn't throw them in that slave pen, that muddy, disgusting, in their own filth, basically torture cage that they're locked in, are quarters for enslaved creatures. Let's change a slaver's den hidden in an orphanage to a thieves' guild hidden in an orphanage, because thieves and slavers are the same thing. We'll change slavers to tyrants, because those are the same thing. All slavers are tyrants, and all tyrants are slavers. You can't be an evil ruler without being a slave driver, and you can't sell slaves and participate in slavery without being a dark, evil ruler with tons of political power. This is nonsense. So, I'm not going to go too much further into this. A lot of this is stupid. I'm going to put the style guide and whatnot that's included in this article down in the comment section, or I'm sorry, down in the description. But the long and short here is this language these language changes by Wizards of the Coast are not just pandering nonsense. These are really serious quality problems that come out. This shows you, this is the example of why this is bad for the hobby as a whole. Because when these companies capitulate to this nonsense, they hurt the product as a whole by making it less precise, less descriptive, less immersive, less lived in, and less correct in an effort to sterilize it. Nobody wants to read something that is sterilized. Nobody wants to be in a sterilized world. That's not fun. There's no excitement to it. It doesn't evoke emotion. And the big problem is the professionally offended class has gotten to the point where if it evokes a negative emotion, it must be bad. I don't like this. This is uncomfortable. It makes me feel weird. You're supposed to. I don't know how these people would ever play a horror game because they're supposed to be transgressed. Negative emotions have their place. You can't, it's like the Eagles said in Desperado. You're losing all your highs and lows. You gotta have lows to have the highs. You can't constantly be nothing but positive emotions. I hate to tell it to you, but you can't appreciate the good if there's no bad. So you're gonna have to come to terms with some negative emotions in order for there to be emotion and life in these worlds. And these companies, by sterilizing this, are just making it a less attractive product and a less enrapturing world for us to be in. So that's it from me. Rant over. Like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.